Tonight we're going to talk about the 5 R's, and I just want to say first of all some of our research strengths in the department, some of which are represented here by the panel, some which are represented by other staff who are in the audience tonight. But the key strengths of our department, the reason I'm telling you this is because, you know, we want you to collaborate with us. So these are the areas where we have specific research strengths, so please be in contact with us. So some of those areas are digital literacies, STEM, language and literacies, child development and pedagogy, including from birth right through the lifespan, leadership and management, teacher professional learning, and inclusive and special education. So we have research strengths in all of those areas. I just want to share our vision with you. We developed this collaboratively at the beginning of the year, and we feel that it's an ambitious vision, and it's underpinned by our 5 R's. And the 5 R's underpin our teaching programs, and we're using those as the logic that we use to think about what sort of teachers do we want to graduate and what sort of in-service teachers can we help to develop. So those are our 5 R's. You may have seen those in our Inspire Thinking newsletter. The first edition of that newsletter included the 5 R's. You can also find these elaborated on our new Department of Educational Studies website. So we're going to talk about each of those today and talk a little bit about some of the research behind these areas and why we think they're so important for our graduating teachers and for practicing teachers. So we all know that teaching is a complex pursuit with competing demands, increasingly diverse student groups, high accountability, new requirements, new evidence to be adopted regularly. So at Macquarie, we really want to graduate teachers who have the relevant discipline knowledge and teaching know-how, but who also strive for and understand those capabilities that will make for a sustainable career. So we want our teachers to be reflexive in their teaching practice. So that's what we're talking about, reflexivity in teaching practice. So teaching is about understanding multiple and changing ecologies of learning. So individual student needs, the affordances of classroom spaces, student and teacher relationships, curriculum, research evidence, school culture, parental expectations, community demographics and needs, expectations of the profession and of government. And all of those things are things that teachers need to manage. It's very complex as a profession, and I don't think the public necessarily understand that. It is really very complex for teachers to deal with. And so teachers need to mediate all of those elements. And so they really need to think about their own motivations, their own priorities in order to make impactful decisions to affect student outcomes. And, you know, make sure that all students are achieving and maximise the outcomes for all students. So we also think resilience is important. Teachers need to maintain their holistic health and sense of coherence so they can manage these uncertain and complex issues and all of those unexpected events that come up. The 3rd R is responsive. We need to be responsive to students, to colleagues, to parents, to professional communities. Teaching is a relational profession. It's not just about numbers. It's about great teachers making deep connections with students, with parents, and with communities. Our 4th R, are we up to our 4th R? Yes, ready to learn? When teachers graduate from university, that's not the end of their learning journey. It's the beginning. Ongoing pursuit of learning is the mark of a quality teaching profession. Sometimes we suffer from an image problem in teaching, but that's a mark of a quality profession where teachers are undergoing ongoing professional learning. Research engaged is our final R, and that's where effective teachers base their practice on evidence. This evidence can come from their own research in the classroom and also from the latest academic research. Having an understanding of data is important so that it can be analysed and woven back into practice. But data can be big or small, and both types are important. Big data includes the large standardised tests that we're getting so used to because they identify trends that are happening. But they don't give us the detail necessarily about why. Why are these trends happening? So that's where small data comes in. Small data includes classroom assessment, which gives us details about how and why students are succeeding or need particular help in areas. So using the 5Rs framework as a conscious guide can help teachers to stay focused on what's important, and it can enable them to have a sustainable career. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each one. I'll start by talking about reflexive. And reflexive means moving from reflective, which we often talk about reflective practice in teaching, but sometimes reflective practice just stays here. It doesn't always lead to action. So reflexivity demands action. Reflexivity includes reflection. Yes, we need to reflect on what's happening, but we absolutely need to share those thoughts about what's happening, why, what could be underpinning this. Jenny Gore and colleagues have shown quite clearly that to share that dialogue around teaching has an absolutely transformative effect on practice. So keeping it to yourself doesn't necessarily lead to change. When you have those conversations with colleagues, those professional conversations around teaching, that's when the transformation happens. So that's what we need to do to be reflexive. So it's not just focusing on self, it's self in context. Drawing in those contextual elements that we know are so important around the children, the students, around the community, around the school. All of those things are essential to think about in relation to yourself. So thinking about self, what are the skills and knowledge I do have? What are the things actually I really need to know more about? I need to find out a bit more about that to deal with and manage these things that are in my context right now. And of course we know they change. They change within a year, they change from year to year, so we need to be able to continue learning so that we can manage those. Epistemic fluency is a part of reflexivity, and that's the capacity to integrate different bodies of knowledge to make well-informed decisions for student engagement, learning and well-being. That's absolutely important. It relates back to what I was saying earlier about all of those competing demands that teachers need to deal with. So it's that knowledge of how to bring those things together and for the best outcomes for students. And of course, it needs to be bent back into practice. It's no point reflecting unless we then do something about it. We absolutely need to bend that evidence back into our practice. And so, interestingly, it includes all of those things I've talked about, the self-evaluation of skills, knowledge, priorities, values. So it's about self, but it's also about those external things like valid assessment data, using evidence, but also the contextual conditions. Now, literature out of the epistemic cognition field shows that there's sometimes a mismatch between what teachers say about what they believe about knowledge and then what their practices look like. So teachers might say that they believe that knowledge is sophisticated, it's complex, it's not just black and white, but then their practice treats it like initiation response evaluation. Let's get kids to guess what's in our head. So that's where the mismatch happens. It's you have these beliefs about knowledge, you have these beliefs about assessment, but if they don't calibrate with your practice, that doesn't help. So it's about thinking, being reflexive about how we calibrate these things. How do we think about how we fold what our beliefs are into our practice truly, and not just on the surface. You know, we have to walk the walk as well. Resilient is the next one, and I'll start that, and then I'll invite Melissa up to say a little bit about this one as well. So resilience, of course, is important, as I explained. I've been involved in a research project with early career teachers in regional areas. We followed these teachers across a whole year, their first year of teaching. They were all in regional areas in one of the Australian states. I won't identify that. But we were working with a school system in that state that believed that they had an excellent mentoring program in place, that their early career teachers were well cared for, that leaders knew exactly what they needed to do to support those early career teachers. So we asked these teachers this was a little app called Going OK that we asked them to continue to use throughout their year. And they needed to slide the bar across to show whether they were going okay, they were soaring, or they were distressed. And then in the bottom, they could put some comments in there. And what we found, that there were 3 types of resources that these early career teachers drew on. One was personal. So it was about the motivation, their disciplinary knowledge, so their preparation to teach the discipline, their interest, their professional learning, their well-being, and their resilience. So those personal qualities. That was one. That was a really important one. Another one was cultural, and that was all about what was given importance in the setting. So it was like the values and the beliefs, the expectations in the setting where they were, the socialisation into the profession. So how did that school help to socialise that teacher into the profession? And the view of leadership held by the school. The third resource or set of resources was structural, around all of that, the tasks, the requirements, the support structures, so the things on the ground and the resources available to those teachers. So those were the 3 resources that were very prominent for these early career teachers. And here's what some of the plot lines looked like. So we had Karen, who's the top plot line. Now, both of these teachers, Karen and Amanda, drew very heavily on their personal resources. That was very strong. They were so motivated. They were so keen. You know, early career teachers, first out. And they also engaged in practices that helped them to become resilient, like being organised, making sure that they planned things well, planning lessons. So they were putting lots of effort in those personal resources to make sure that they could have a sustainable first year. And, part of that is knowing what's realistic. So for Karen, who's the top line, you can see there at the beginning she's a bit up and down. That's where she's drawing on the personal. As it moves along, those other resources kicked in. So people at the school realised they needed to actually support her more. The principal jumped in, they started to have conversations about what she needed, like she had a really heavy teaching load, and they finally realised, actually, that's probably not sustainable. We probably need to take some of that off you. She had a lack of mentoring, she was feeling isolated because she was in a regional area, managing very difficult student behaviour, and in some cases, difficult parent behaviour. So, but once those other resources kicked in, you can see she has levelled out to a reasonable level in the Going OK, which meant that she decided to stay. Amanda, on the other hand, also drawing heavily on her personal resources, putting things in place. Well, those cultural and structural resources never kicked in for her. And that's what happened. So the leadership at the school did things like cancelling planning meetings, without even realising that was a huge source of support for an early career teacher. So they did things that they didn't even realise that this would have an impact. We'll cancel a meeting, everyone will be happy. But in fact, no. She needed that as an absolute source of support. So she didn't get that kind of support. And what happened? She left. She left teaching. She didn't just leave the school, she left teaching. These plot lines were really very interesting. And we realised one of our findings was the importance of dialogic leadership. Principals and leaders in the school need to have those reflexive conversations with teachers. And not just early career teachers, with all teachers. Logging, identifying concerns, clarifying issues, and attending to them and prioritising and making decisions and acting on those. So those support structures are there, because we need all three of the resources: personal, cultural, structural. They all need to be there to have a sustainable career. And now I'm going to hand over to Melissa.
Thank you, Mary, and welcome. What I would like to do in my few minutes to talk to you is talk about resilience and give some context as to why we see resilience as so important, and then talk about some strategies that will be useful for teachers and other professionals working in other industries as well. And there are some synergies with what Mary's talked about in her line of research. From a health perspective, it is really important for us to understand resilience and how to foster it. For several years now, we have seen increasing rates in the proportion of the population experiencing depression and mental health problems. It's projected that by 2030, which is really not that far away, that depression will be the leading cause of disease burden globally, and this is taking over from physical health conditions. So there has previously been very much a focus on the risk factors for poor mental health and how to avoid those or prevent them. But the space is kind of moving into a sphere where we're much more focused on taking a strengths-based approach, looking at what skills and capabilities individuals have, and drawing upon those and fostering those as a way to protect mental health. And understanding resilience is really key to this. We will all face adversity to some extent in our life, but the ability to be able to bounce back is very important for our health. Some of the early research on resilience, some of the really early significant studies on resilience, we're looking at children born into poverty, when we know that there tend to be poor health outcomes and overall poor outcomes in later life. But they found that the children who transitioned into adulthood and were leading quite successful, happy, functioning lives, what differentiated those from children who didn't go on to have more successful life outcomes was that the children who went on to have quite happy, functioning lives, they could identify someone from their childhood who they felt believed in them, who trusted them, and who they felt connected to. And this has really prompted an area of research at what are the other things that can help people bounce back from adversity. We know that being mindful that there will be stresses and challenges in our working lives and lives is important, rather than hoping or wishing that they're not going to happen, those difficult conversations with parents. Being prepared for them, accepting that they will happen, equips people with better coping strategies to be able to handle those situations when they do occur. Similarly, understanding our triggers for stress is really important, because it enables us to start thinking about strategies that we can put in place early to be able to deal with those. And also being able to, when we are experiencing a difficult situation, being able to draw upon some meaning or purpose in that event is really important. And we can draw upon research in other areas as well, such as caseworkers and social workers who work in areas where there's really quite a high emotional toll. And the ones that are doing okay are the ones who can identify some meaning in what they're doing and purpose in what they're doing in those difficult circumstances. Gratitude, I know the term gets thrown around quite a lot, but there's not necessarily a good understanding of how to actually practice gratitude. How do we actually do that? But it is quite simple, and there's some really exciting research out there at the moment of implementing some simple strategies that can, where we can see changes in our sense of gratitude and our sense of resilience. A study has looked at individuals keeping a journal for about a month, And each day, responding to the questions, what was the best thing that happened to me today? Who am I most grateful for and why? And what am I most looking forward to tomorrow? And they found that just after 21 days, individuals' brains, they sort of started to rewire, and people could more easily identify the positive things that were happening in their lives. And they were 3 times more likely to be able to easily identify positive things that were happening in their lives. And finally, and very importantly, and building upon what Mary has talked about, social support, we've known for quite some time that good quality social support is so important for individuals' mental health. And there is an abundant amount of research looking at this. It is so important for individuals. There's also a growing amount of research looking at the importance of being involved in different groups as well. And it's a different kind of perspective on how we think about social support. So in the teaching context, it is important for teachers to feel connected to their school and identify with that group, we could refer to it as, maybe even a subset of teachers who are teaching in the related field. But it's also important for individuals to be a member of groups outside of that work environment. And we found that individuals who can still identify themselves as a member of a group with their university friends or a sporting group or a reading group, individuals who are a member of multiple groups tend to have a greater sense of identity, meaning, purpose in their life. And we've seen some significant findings in terms of resilience and mental health. We've seen that amongst samples of clinically depressed individuals, those who joined more groups over time, we've seen a reduction in depressive symptoms. We've seen them less likely to relapse. I've done some work with individuals who are in a state of homelessness, and we followed them transitioning out of homelessness. Those who joined more groups were less likely to relapse back into homelessness and had an overall sense of well-being. So some of the things that I've talked about, I think apply to teachers and the population more broadly. But from a health perspective, it's important to think about strategies that can be put in place early to foster resilience, because this is so important for people's health. I'd like to just pass over to Faye, who's going to take us through responsiveness. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay. So I get to talk about responsiveness, and what I want you to be thinking about while I'm talking about that is, what's your lens? How do you see being responsive to the children, the families, the colleagues that you work with, the community stakeholders that within the context of your educational setting? Because we can view it as a problem, we can view it as fraught, as dangerous, as problematic, or we can view it from the lens of an opportunity. Oh, I made it go away and I made it come back. I would ask you to think about this as an opportunity. Not all relationships and connections with children, students, families are easy. They are difficult. We know that. Melissa was just talking about that previously. But if we start to think about what are the opportunities, how can I reframe and rethink this relationship and being responsive, we actually have a different outcome for children and families. And our role is about growing those synapses. Now, we talk a lot about brain development and synapses, but the most important research the research tells us that if we are responsive to the children and the families and the students that are in our classrooms, then we are going to provide they're going to have better educational outcomes, but not just educational outcomes, social and emotional outcomes. So I ask you to think about that in terms of where you sit and where do you see these things. And often with an opportunity or a threat, when we get those children and students in our classroom and we connect with them and they're easy to work with, then it's really easy work for us. But it's those children or families that challenge us, who will question what we're doing. That's the children and families that often we find those relationships a little bit more difficult to work with. So we do know, as I said before, for children and students, our relationships, the responsiveness that we do, does have huge outcomes. So if our children and students in our classrooms, in our educational settings, feel like that they belong, feel like that we have a connection with them, feel like that we like them as a person, not just as a child or a student in our classroom, then they do better because they connect with us. They can feel that they have a sense of belonging. With families, if families are listened to, if they are heard, if we try to understand from their perspective. So I would say For example, when we're talking about conversations with families, I would ask you to reframe, is it really a difficult conversation, as Melissa was talking about, or is it a conversation that makes me have to think about my values, my beliefs of this child or of this classroom that I'm teaching in, and do I need to reframe, rethink? And really, we know that when we start to give those families those opportunities where we open up and we reframe that relationship with them, then they're more likely to come back and talk to us again. They're more likely to connect with us. And the research tells us really strongly, right through from early childhood right through to secondary, that when families feel engaged and have a sense of involvement in their child's education, the child does better, the student does better. And that's right from birth right through to secondary. The research is really strong in that area, not only in Australia, but in the UK, in America, across our OECD countries. So it is about reframing that relationship with those families. The other thing is we need to be responsive to our colleagues. We don't work in isolation in a classroom, in a school setting, an early childhood setting. We are working with colleagues. And so, again, there are colleagues that we get on with really well, and we get them because they're like us. They see the world the same way that we do, so it's much easier to connect with them. But there are colleagues that challenge us or do things in a different way that we may not think is not the way that we would do it. But I would question, is there really a right or a wrong way? We actually know in teaching there actually is no right way to teach a child. There is no wrong, there's potentially wrong ways, but there's no right way. And so when we reframe that and think about the colleagues that we're working with and think about, well, let's listen to their perspective. Let's hear how they see this happening and unfolding, and can I learn something from them? So again, it's moving back into Mary's session when she was talking about being reflexive. So we have to really think about these and ponder these things and have deep connections and deep conversations with our colleagues. The other thing that is really important is community. So we don't teach in isolation. We do sit within a community. We have a context. Our educational setting sits within a community, and it's really important that we start to build those connections with those stakeholders within our community. Unfortunately, we still really do have an education silo. We have a health silo, as the Grace reference talks about. So it is our responsibility as the teachers of that class, of that school, of that early childhood centre, to go out and connect with the community, to find those professionals that we need to connect with that are going to help us do a better job. So it is about that multidisciplinary approach. And we know, and we've got some really strong longitudinal research in the UK where when you have a multidisciplinary team, you actually have better outcomes for the children. So better educational outcomes for those children and students, but also better social and emotional outcomes. The other thing that we know in those longitudinal research studies is that it actually helps families. It helps families when we are working in a multidisciplinary team. Because often those families, if they're finding themselves in a vulnerable situation or in a crisis, it is about us being able to connect them with those community stakeholders. So what I would ask you to do is to think about that partnerships or being responsive. There are many roads that you can travel, and that there is no one road that you're going to go down and it's going to work every time. And what I would challenge you to think about in your particular educational setting that you are in right now, who do you think is silenced in in your educational setting? Who do you think is maybe not really listened to or responded to? A research project I did a few years ago with some early childhood centres is we actually asked them to go and connect. Think of one parent that they didn't really connect with or didn't feel like they had a connection with and do something differently. And so they actually had to come up with a different strategy, not do the same thing that they've been doing. And when they came back and talked about what they had done, and there are many different strategies that they did, but what that research project proved was that because those teachers got out of their comfort zone and they did something differently, those families, they actually broke down the barriers. They broke down that relationship with the families so that the families actually started to trust them. The families actually started to come in and talk to them, the parent that they made that connection with. So the research is really clear in terms of that being responsive, it really does make a difference for those children's outcomes. But to me, it's not their job to connect with us. We're the teacher. It's our classroom. It's our job to make sure that we connect with those children, the students, the families, the colleagues, the community that we're working with. It's our job to make them feel welcome into our space. It is our space. We have a lot of power, and no matter how much we try not to have that power, we do have that power. It's our classroom. It's our profession. So I challenge you to think about anybody in your particular classroom setting. It could be a child, it could be a parent, it could be a colleague, or it could be a stakeholder that you're trying to connect with in the community. And I challenge you to do one thing differently. And I'd love to hear, email me, whatever, and to let me know. It's a little experiment. And so that's my challenge to you tonight. Thank you. And Iain.
Thanks very much, Faye. Excellent, you can hear me. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, colleagues, and special welcome to our colleagues from our hub schools, Carlingford West Public School and Kalara High School colleagues that are probably out there as well. Ready to learn, okay? It sounds like it's easy, but in fact, it can be a challenge. Obviously, we're thinking about professional learning and that idea of continual learning. Some of the research indicates that teachers need to be ready to take on that learning rather than an enforced approach saying that we've got PD coming up, that's it, you've got to get the hours, we'll tick it off. In fact, that we know that if teachers are prepared to engage and they've self-identified the areas that they need to develop themselves, it has more relevance to them. And I suppose for my thinking or early work, it was around the concept of lifelong learning, and this has been bandied around for a number of years. But what is actually meant by lifelong learning? I'm looking at Louise Watson's early work here. She did quite a major review for the Commonwealth some years ago. But lifelong learning is a continuously supportive process. Okay, and what we're trying to do in the Department of Educational Studies is establish the Academy for Continuing Professional Development that wrap around the idea of being agile, responsive to the needs of colleagues in schools, but including leaders in schools. That we identify those learning aspects that can support quality teaching, engaging with families, being responsive to self. And being able to identify those learning needs. But within an academy, we're wanting to perform research along the way. How do we actually know it's having an impact on our colleagues in their learning, but also their understanding of quality teaching? There was a quote that I came across recently that the best teachers never stop learning. We expect our learners every day to continue learning. So it's important that we demonstrate that idea, that concept of lifelong learning. There's also some literature around teacher self-efficacy increasing at the point of professional learning, but we also know that there's a point where that runs out. Okay, in some of my early work, I delivered some particular PD, measured self-efficacy obviously at the beginning as a pretest, and at the end, over a number of weeks, measured again that level of self-efficacy, and then, that's great, and then what we find is that there's a point where things are moving along and people are connected to the learning that they've had and they're excited about what they've learned, and then it runs out. Now what? What do I do now? I think I've gotten to that point, but where to from here? So with our thinking around the academy, it's about the re-engagement of our PD. So our learning is really targeted for the needs and responses of schools and school communities, but at the same time we're wanting to look at what happens when we get to the point of re-engagement. You know, what's needed in the next phase. So we're wanting to perform some research around actually expanding that thinking. Another aspect that we've looked at is that the work of NESA already. Many of you in this room may have done the survey, I think it was about 2015, around PD. And I've drawn on particular information here around that the majority of teachers who found it exciting to apply their learning from the PD to their practice reported the potential benefits for their students. And Hadley talks about the difference that teachers make on the achievement levels of students. So, you know, we have a long tradition in our profession around continuing professional development. It's not a new thing, but I think what we've sort of fallen into the trap of in recent years is, I've got to do the PD, I've got to get the hours, I've got to get the tick. I'm not saying anyone in this room, but beyond here may be in that situation where we're trying to flip that and work closely with our colleagues in schools to say, well, what is it that we need to address and support in the development of your PD, but also the directions of your school, so that it's still relevant to colleagues in schools, but at the same time that we have a research basis to it. So in our department, we are looking at the alignments of our research to developing PD around that, but at the same time taking the feedback from our colleagues involved in that professional learning to re-engage again, but also to look at the next phase of PD. I thank you very much. I believe I've got that.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Iain has introduced me, I'm Garry Falloon. I joined the Department of Educational Studies a few months ago from the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. And when I was preparing the notes for this talk, I said to my wife, what should I say? And she said, it doesn't matter as long as you don't use the number 6. So there's a distinct lack of digits in this particular presentation. Anyway, it's great to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you tonight about our department's goal of developing research-engaged teachers. When I began my teaching career in primary schools in New Zealand, to me research was something that was done by someone else, some mysterious people in places like this. And to be frank, I considered it had little to do with the realities of what went on in my classroom. But things are very different now. Gone are the days of fixed and uncontested understandings that were considered sufficient to last your entire teaching career. Gone are the stable and unchanging environments we once worked in. Teachers now experience very dynamic and rapidly changing environments, where adaptability and a capacity to embrace and realise opportunities from change are essential qualities. And to do this, they need both the skills and the dispositions to use contemporary research to inform their decision-making, to optimise and make their teaching more efficient and effective, and to provide the best possible learning outcomes for their students. Therefore, one of our department's primary goals is to build research-engaged teachers who view their practice as a continuous process of research-informed inquiry, where evidence gathered is used as a basis for ongoing improvements to programs and pedagogy. We see willingness to engage with and access to the latest in educational research as a vital part of achieving this goal, and we are endeavouring to build this into our units and programs at every opportunity through promoting teaching as a research-informed inquiry. Aligned with this, we're supporting the department staff to build their research capacity and profile through work both within our programs at Macquarie and wider afield through a suite of research-based initiatives both planned and currently happening across a range of community, education and business contexts. These diverse activities vary from initiatives engaging Indigenous populations and research projects aimed at improving social and educational opportunities, through to work in schools and early childhood education context, exploring new curriculum designs and opportunities and approaches to teaching, learning and assessment. Also emerging are exciting partnerships with education-focused businesses and industries, where department staff are working alongside private sector companies and organisations keen to trial and research new educational resources and innovations. We intend to extend our research work in coming months through, amongst other initiatives, research and teaching projects designed to enhance staff digital capabilities and changed focus peer review of teaching research studies. We view the production of high quality research, publications and presentations that have impact and are accessible to our increasingly diverse audiences as central to our core business. And we welcome the opportunity to further our work with stakeholders, diverse as they are, through engaging them as partners in our research collaborations. Thank you very much.
being teachers, we've all spoken for too long. Sorry about that. So we don't have a huge amount of time for questions, but we've had quite a number of questions submitted, so thank you very much for your engagement. So what we've done is kind of grouped the questions into major themes because we won't have time to address them all. And in fact, I think even some of the questions that we were going to address have probably already been addressed in our presentation. But perhaps I can ask this question, and I think I'll address this question to Iain, actually. Ongoing reflection and professional development are essential for improving a teacher's performance. How can teachers demonstrate commitment to developing their professional practice, knowledge and engagement? So I guess it's a bit of a follow-on from what you've already said, Iain.
Sure. I think, I think establishing a planned approach to professional learning. Firstly, there's that requirement to have critical reflection to think about, but then to put into action the development of identified learning goals yourself. And I think it's about being truthful to yourself. We often think, oh no, I'm doing okay, I've got this all under control. But as soon as we have that conversation or the dialogue around, and particularly working with colleagues in the school to identify, well, how can I access support in this area? Now that might be just incidentally with colleagues in conversation, but you might feel you need a more sort of delivered, considered learning experience, and we're here to do that at Macquarie. In the academy, we're really keen to address some of those big questions, but I think having a very planned approach to PD, but at the same time having the conversations with colleagues and mentors about that, because often the support around your development is located in schools, and there are planned approaches to that, but at the same time there's so many opportunities beyond the school in PD that you can address by looking on various websites, but as well as the NESA website has a huge amount of PD that you can access.
And just following up on that, Iain, I think we're also trying to encourage at Macquarie that cohorts of teachers come in and do professional learning, which is actually based on a project that they want to undertake in their school. So if you're interested in that, Eric mentioned briefly at the beginning about our scholarships that we're offering. What those scholarships are, scholarships in our postgraduate area. So they will actually lead to a graduate certificate in educational studies, which you could potentially then move into a master's from that. But we are offering a scholarship there so that, certain units, you'll get recognised prior learning. If you've been teaching for a certain number of years, it's 3 or 4 years, you'll get recognised prior learning for a unit. You will give you a scholarship for another unit. And so it's actually quite a good approach where we really would like a cohort of teachers from a school to come in and actually work on a project with us, alongside us, and achieve a graduate certificate. So, that cohort approach and that shared dialogue around that project, we find, because the research shows that just one-off PD doesn't necessarily lead to transformation in practice. It just doesn't. But ongoing, reflexive, shared dialogue, those are the things that help us to transform our practice. So the second question is one that's it came up quite a bit throughout our presentations. I think it's a really important one, and it relates to the changing nature of teachers' work and the demands placed upon teachers as they endeavour to provide the best learning environments they can for their students. So the question is, how can we build strategies and capabilities to support teachers entering the profession to deal positively with the dynamic and rapidly changing environments within which they'll function, and to address issues such as teacher burnout and stress? So maybe, Garry, you could start?
Sure, thanks. Thanks very much for that, Mary. I had a response to this written down, but I'm actually going to change it completely and draw on some personal experience of this coming from New Zealand, where the land of earthquakes, as you probably know, and coming from the situation where my home city of Christchurch was flattened by an earthquake recently. And it was fascinating to see the response of government to that as an opportunity to close schools. And a lot of the teachers were up in arms about that. You know, there was enough stress in their lives, and there were all sorts of things happening around curriculum and change that happened before that really compounded it. And one of the major strategies that actually mitigated those government intentions was mobilising community. And the ability of schools to actually, and teachers within them, to get the parents on their side and to advocate for them was a very effective strategy for dealing with those situations. And that translates both back into your classroom. You know, we have a selling job to do with our communities to get them to understand that curriculum is different to what it was perhaps when you were at school. When parents were at school, things were a little different to what they are now. You know, the sort of skills and capabilities that young people need going forward are quite different. Perhaps certainly different, very different when I was at school, but probably different to when the parents were as well. And educating the community about those differences is a critical job that schools have to do. So you're not just educating the children, you've also got to look at educating the parents. Once you've got the parents on your side, you're away.
Mm. And Melissa, would you like?
Yeah, I would like to just say a couple of things as well. I think, as mentioned, you know, having, in terms of preventing stress and burnout, social support is so important in that team environment because you can share strategies and generate solutions together, but also you feel connected as part of a team. But Iain, I'm glad you mentioned self-efficacy as well, because we do know that teachers who have a strong sense of self-efficacy are more resilient, have better well-being. But self-efficacy is a really difficult thing to tackle. You don't just suddenly wake up one day and feel really confident in your abilities to be able to do something. It's kind of a process and something that needs to be built. And I think there are a couple of strategies that can be implemented, particularly for new teachers, helping teachers practice good time management skills. If you're talking about multiple demands, you know, you can easily get yourself into a situation where you feel like you're failing, you're not achieving everything you want to. But helping develop those good time management skills, so you're ticking off the things that you want to do, can help to kind of build that confidence and your sense of achievement in what you're doing. And the other one is realistic goal setting as well. So clear, realistic, achievable goals, particularly for new teachers. And it may be a case of setting out quite small goals to begin with and developing those, but they need to be very achievable goals. So teachers are getting a sense of achievement and feeling that they're building their confidence in their ability and what they're doing. But in addition to that, they need to be very specific goals as well. It can be very easy for a new teacher to start and think, I want to do a good job. But what does that mean? Because that goal of a good job, it's a moving target. You need to set very clear goals, and maybe even taking, like the challenge that Faye said, just engaging with one family that you haven't done in the past, or setting those quite clear, specific goals can be helpful.
And just to follow up on that, Melissa, in our project with early career teachers, you know, it's that some of them actually didn't know what were realistic goals. They didn't have a sense of what was realistic. They just thought, wow, is this it? And no one kind of explained what might be a realistic goal for them. So, you know, I think that input from others is so crucial. Yes, yeah. Absolutely crucial. Okay, well, I think we're probably about out of time. So if you'd like to connect with us, please do. Some of you, I think, already subscribe to our newsletter, Inspire Thinking. If you don't, we'll be sending out an email afterwards so that you can click on the link to subscribe. We've got lots of great stories in there and some research and profiles and so on that you might be interested in. So please do sign up to our newsletter. But also, you know, contact us if you're interested in our scholarships, but also if you'd like to connect with us around some of those areas of research. We'd be really pleased to chat to you about that. So thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate your engagement.